The deaf girl's desperate signs through the window spelled "Save me" in perfect clarity. But the vampire king reading them from the alley had spent centuries mastering her language, and her plea wasn't a cry for help. It was an invitation he'd been waiting lifetimes to receive. Lydia's fingers pressed against the cold window glass, her movements sharp and desperate as she signed into the empty alley below. 3 days. 3 days since Marcus Webb had locked her in this suffocating apartment after she'd witnessed him stuffing briefcases with cash in the back room of City Hall, his careful politician's mask slipping just long enough for her to see the predator underneath. Her wrists ached from testing the zip ties he'd used initially, though he'd removed them yesterday when it became clear she had nowhere to run. The third-floor window offered no escape route, just a straight drop to cobblestones that had seen centuries of secrets spilled in their shadows. "Save me," her hands spelled again and again, each gesture growing more frantic as exhaustion crept through her bones. The Victorian alley stretched narrow and crooked between brick buildings that leaned toward each other like conspirators, their gas lamps casting pools of amber light that danced with every gust of wind. Marcus had chosen this place carefully, she realized. No foot traffic, no curious neighbors, just the kind of forgotten corner where screams would echo unheard and disappearances would puzzle police for exactly as long as his political influence allowed. Her art student stipend had been enough for a tiny studio in the trendy district, but Marcus's men had dragged her here after the confrontation, to this place that smelled of old wood and older secrets. The apartment itself felt frozen in time, with heavy furniture that belonged in a museum and wallpaper that had probably witnessed a dozen similar crimes. "Save me," she signed again, though her rational mind whispered that no one could see her. No one could understand her silent language. No one cared about one deaf girl who'd seen too much. The gas lamps flickered as wind rattled the window frame, and for a moment she thought she saw movement in the darkest corner of the alley, where shadows pooled so thick they seemed solid. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed closer to the glass, breath fogging the surface as she strained to see. The darkness shifted, and suddenly pale hands emerged from the void, fingers moving with impossible grace as they shaped words she knew by heart. "I see you," the hands said, in perfect ASL, and Lydia's world tilted sideways. The figure stepped forward just enough for the nearest gas lamp to catch the sharp angles of his face, skin so pale it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, eyes that held depths she couldn't fathom. "You are not alone," his hands continued, each gesture flowing into the next with a fluidity that spoke of decades of practice. Lydia's own hands froze mid-sign, her mind reeling as she tried to process what she was seeing. No one knew she was here. Marcus had been careful about that, had made sure his operation stayed invisible to anyone who might care about one missing art student. But this stranger not only knew she was trapped, he understood her language with a precision that made her chest tight with sudden hope and terror. "Who are you?" she managed to sign back, her movements clumsy with shock. The stranger's mouth curved in something that might have been a smile, though it never reached his eyes. "My name is Dmitri," his hands replied, "and I have been watching over this neighborhood for longer than you might believe." His signing style was formal, almost archaic, as if he'd learned the language from textbooks rather than conversation, but every gesture was perfectly formed. "Why?" she asked, then quickly added, "How long have you known I was here?" "Long enough to know that your captor is a man who believes power makes him untouchable." Dimitri's hands shaped carefully. "Long enough to see that you are not the first person to disappear into these shadows." His pale fingers paused, and even from 3 stories up, she could see something ancient and tired in his expression. "But you are the first to speak a language I understand completely." The words hit her like physical blows, both terrifying and thrilling in their implications. She'd spent her entire life being the only deaf person in most rooms, constantly translating between her visual world and everyone else's auditory one, always feeling like she was watching life through glass. But this stranger, this Dmitri, moved his hands like ASL was his native tongue rather than something learned for convenience. I want to help you, he continued, but there are rules that govern what I can and cannot do. Rules that were written long before your country existed, before these streets were paved, before gas lamps replaced torches in these alleys. Rules about interference in human affairs. Lydia's mind raced as she tried to parse his meaning. There was something about the way he stood perfectly still between gestures, the way shadows seemed to bend around him rather than fall across him, that made her skin prickle with instinctive recognition of something beyond ordinary human experience. What kind of rules? She asked, though part of her already suspected the answer would be stranger than she was prepared for. The kind that separate my world from yours, Dmitri replied, his hands moving with deliberate care. The kind that say I may observe and protect from a distance, but direct action requires justification that your councilman's crimes do not provide. He paused, and she saw his jaw tighten with what looked like centuries of frustration. But there are exceptions, loopholes written by those who understood that sometimes the letter of the law serves evil, while its spirit demands justice. Before Lydia could respond, footsteps echoed from the stairwell outside her prison door. Marcus was returning early from whatever business had kept him away for the past 6 hours, and the sound of his key in the lock sent ice through her veins. She looked back toward the window desperately, but Dmitri had vanished so completely it might have been a hallucination brought on by isolation and fear. The door swung open, and Marcus Webb stepped inside, his politician's smile firmly in place, despite the cruelty that leaked around its edges. Still trying to redecorate the window, Lydia, he said, his voice carrying the patronizing tone he probably used on constituents who asked inconvenient questions. She turned from the glass slowly, her face carefully blank as she met his gaze. Marcus was handsome in the way that helped men win elections, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines that suggested wisdom rather than the calculation she'd learned to recognize. He'd built his career on being the councilman who cared about accessibility issues, who fought for the disabled community's rights, who posed for photos at deaf school fundraisers. The irony of her situation would have been funny if it weren't so terrifying. I was just looking at the architecture, she signed, knowing he wouldn't understand, but hoping her expression would convey boredom rather than the desperate hope still racing through her system. Very old buildings. Marcus nodded as if he'd understood every word, another habit from his public life that he maintained even here. Yes, this district has quite a history, he said conversationally, moving to the small kitchen area and opening a bag of takeout that smelled like expensive Thai food. I thought you might be getting hungry. It's important to keep your strength up. The casual domesticity of the moment felt surreal after her encounter with Dmitri, but Lydia forced herself to nod gratefully as Marcus set out containers of pad thai and green curry. He'd been playing this game for 3 days, treating her imprisonment like an extended house guest situation, as if politeness might eventually convince her to forget what she'd witnessed. But tonight, something felt different, a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. Everything all right? She signed, then spoke the words aloud in the flat tone that came from never hearing her own voice. Just fine, Marcus replied, but his smile felt more forced than usual. Though I did have an interesting conversation with some colleagues today about neighborhood security. Seems there have been some unusual reports lately. Sightings of suspicious individuals in this area after dark. His eyes flicked toward the window, and Lydia's blood turned to ice. Had he seen Dmitri somehow? Or was this just Marcus being paranoid about his operation's security? We might need to be extra careful for the next few days, he continued, settling into the chair across from her with his own container of food. Can't be too cautious when it comes to protecting valuable assets. The word valuable hit her like a slap, stripping away any pretense that this was anything other than what it was. Marcus Webb had decided that her witness testimony was worth more than her freedom, worth more than her life, and he was willing to keep her locked away until he figured out how to neutralize the threat she represented permanently. But as she picked at her food and nodded along to his one-sided conversation, part of her mind remained fixed on the memory of pale hands moving in perfect ASL, of shadows that seemed to bend according to their own rules, of a voice that promised protection even as it admitted to constraints she didn't yet understand. Dmitri was still out there, still watching, still bound by mysterious rules, but looking for exceptions. And for the first time since Marcus had cornered her in that back room at City Hall, Lydia allowed herself to believe that maybe her desperate plea for salvation hadn't fallen on deaf eyes after all. Dmitri descended through stone passages that had been carved before the city above had streets, before gas lamps had replaced torches, before the New World had even dreamed of independence from kings across an ocean. The cathedral's foundations reached deep into bedrock, creating chambers that had served as crypts, wine cellars, and finally the seat of power for creatures who needed no wine and left no bodies behind. Candles flickered in iron sconces along walls that wept centuries of condensation, their flames dancing to rhythms that matched no earthly wind, but rather the breathing of ancient things that no longer needed breath. His footsteps echoed against stone worn smooth by countless midnight processions, each sound carrying the weight of decisions that would ripple through both the supernatural and mortal worlds above. The great chamber opened before him like a Gothic cathedral in miniature, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to move independently of the candlelight below. 5 figures waited around a table carved from a single piece of obsidian, their faces bearing the marble stillness that came with centuries of undeath, their eyes reflecting flames like cut gems catching starlight. Elder Seraphina sat at his right hand, her silver hair pulled back in a style that had been fashionable during the Renaissance and which she'd never bothered to change, her fingers already moving in the silent language that had become their court's preferred method of communication. Dmitri had introduced ASL to his council decades ago, partly for the practical advantage of silent communication, but mostly because spoken words had become hollow things to his damaged ears, while visual language retained all the nuance and poetry he craved. "You put us all at risk," Seraphina's hands shaped with the precise economy of movement that marked her as the council's eldest member. "One human girl cannot be worth exposing our entire species to discovery." Her signs carried the weight of authority earned through 5 centuries of keeping their kind hidden from mortal eyes, of maintaining the delicate balance that allowed vampires to exist in the margins of human society. The other council members nodded their agreement, their faces grave as they contemplated the implications of their king's growing involvement with the trapped artist above. Councillor Victor, turned during the French Revolution and still bearing the rigid posture of military bearing, signed his concerns about precedent and protocol. "If we intervene in human affairs without clear supernatural justification, what prevents every mortal crisis from becoming our responsibility?" Councillor Elena, youngest of their number at barely 2 centuries, added her own fears about modern surveillance technology and the impossibility of maintaining secrecy in an age of cameras and social media. But Dimitri's attention drifted from their debate as memory pulled him backward through time, triggered by Elena's mention of responsibility and the weight of choices that echoed across centuries. The monastery had stood on a hill overlooking what would eventually become the old quarter of their city, its walls built thick enough to withstand siege, and its bells loud enough to call the faithful from miles around. Brother Thomas had been the first to teach him the hand language developed by the monks who'd taken vows of silence, their gestures forming prayers and conversations that existed purely in the space between souls. Dmitri remembered the weight of his sword, still warm from the forge, as raiders approached the monastery walls under cover of darkness. He'd been young then, barely 25, a minor lord whose lands bordered the holy ground and who'd pledged his protection to the brothers who'd shown him kindness after a hunting accident had damaged his hearing beyond any healer's skill. The raiders had come for the monastery's rumored gold, but they'd found instead a young nobleman who fought like a man possessed, defending not just treasure, but the only place where his deafness had been treated as a gift rather than a curse. Steel had rung against steel in the courtyard, where roses grew between prayer stones, and Dmitri had felt mortality singing in his veins as he fought to protect the gentle hands that had taught him to speak without words. The abbot had died in his arms, fingers still moving in blessing, even as blood frothed from his lips, and something in that moment had cracked open in Dmitri's chest that would never fully heal. He'd survived the battle, driven off the raiders, saved most of the brothers, but the injuries he'd sustained should have killed him. Instead, he'd awakened 3 nights later with fangs, and an eternity of darkness ahead, transformed by a vampire who'd been drawn to his sacrifice and who'd offered him immortal life as a reward for his devotion to protecting the innocent. The memory faded as Seraphina's hands cut sharply through his reverie, bringing him back to the present. Crisis with uncomfortable precision. "You are thinking of the monastery again," she signed, her expression softening slightly, with something that might have been sympathy if vampires were capable of such mortal emotions. But that was different. Those were holy grounds under supernatural protection, and you were already dying when you chose to fight. This human girl is just another casualty of mortal corruption, no different from thousands of others who suffer while we maintain our necessary distance. Dmitri's jaw tightened as he considered his response, weighing centuries of careful neutrality against the memory of desperate hands signing "Save me" through glass that might as well have been prison bars. The covenant of silence had been written by vampires who understood the necessity of remaining hidden, who'd witnessed the consequences of exposure during the witch trials and inquisitions that had claimed as many vampire lives as mortal ones. But the covenant also contained provisions for exceptional circumstances, loopholes crafted by those who'd understood that absolute rules served absolute corruption. "I have been investigating Marcus Webb's activities more thoroughly," Dmitri signed finally, his hands moving with the deliberate care he used when making formal pronouncements. "His crimes extend beyond simple kidnapping. He has been using his position on the city council to funnel municipal contracts through shell companies that serve as fronts for human trafficking operations." The council's collective stillness deepened as they processed this information, their faces reflecting calculations that had less to do with morality and more to do with jurisdictional technicalities. Human trafficking violated several clauses of the Covenant's protection articles, provisions that had been added after vampires had witnessed the horrors of the slave trade and decided that some human suffering demanded supernatural intervention. If Webb's crimes could be proven to cross those thresholds, direct action might be justified under ancient law. Meanwhile, 3 stories above their deliberations, Lydia stared at her reflection in the apartment window and tried to make sense of her growing certainty that Dmitri would return. Marcus had left an hour ago for what he'd called urgent city business, locking the door with the same casual confidence that had marked all his interactions with her. But something had shifted in their dynamic since her encounter with the mysterious figure in the alley. The knowledge that someone knew where she was, someone who understood her language and seemed to possess resources Marcus couldn't anticipate, had given her back a measure of control she'd thought lost forever. She turned from the window to study the art supplies Marcus had provided, supposedly to keep her occupied, but more likely to maintain the fiction that this was voluntary confinement rather than kidnapping. Watercolors, charcoal, sketch paper, even a small set of acrylic paints that suggested he'd done research into her artistic preferences. The gesture might have seemed thoughtful if she hadn't known it was just another form of manipulation, a way to keep her docile while he figured out how to eliminate the threat she represented permanently. But Marcus had made a crucial mistake in giving her access to visual tools, because Lydia's art training had included extensive study of symbolic communication systems, from medieval illuminated manuscripts to modern graphic design principles. If Dmitri was watching, if he possessed the historical knowledge his formal ASL style suggested, then perhaps she could create messages that would be invisible to Marcus, but crystal clear to eyes that had seen centuries pass. She arranged her supplies carefully on the small table by the window, positioning herself so that anyone observing from the alley would have a clear view of her work. The first piece she created looked like a simple still life, a bowl of fruit rendered in watercolors with careful attention to light and shadow. But hidden within the composition were symbols she'd learned during her art history studies, references to medieval manuscripts that used fruit arrangements to convey complex theological concepts. The apple's position relative to the pear echoed illuminations from the Book of Kells, while the play of light across their surfaces matched techniques developed by monks who'd understood that pictures could carry messages invisible to illiterate eyes. The second piece, built on the first, a charcoal sketch of the apartment's interior that appeared to be a straightforward architectural study. But Lydia embedded ASL handshapes into the shadows and negative spaces, spelling out words that would be meaningless to casual observers but clear as scripture to anyone fluent in both visual art and sign language. The curve of a chair's arm became the sign for help, while the interplay of light and dark across the wooden floor formed letters that spelled out web and corruption and trafficking. She worked through the night, creating what appeared to be a random collection of artistic exercises, but was actually a comprehensive intelligence report written in a visual code that merged her art training with her native language. Each piece built on the previous one, creating a narrative that told the story of her imprisonment while providing evidence of Marcus's broader criminal activities. The details came from fragments of conversations she'd overheard. Phone calls Marcus thought she couldn't follow because he'd assumed her deafness meant she couldn't read lips. Meetings he'd conducted in her presence because he'd forgotten that deaf didn't mean stupid. By dawn, she'd created a gallery exhibition that would have looked perfectly innocent to Marcus, but would read like an intelligence briefing to anyone who possessed both the visual literacy to decode her artistic references and the historical knowledge to understand her. Medieval manuscript allusions. She arranged the pieces carefully on the windowsill, creating what appeared to be a cheerful display of her artistic productivity, but was actually a sophisticated communication system designed to reach one specific observer. When Marcus returned that afternoon with coffee and pastries that suggested he was still committed to the fiction of voluntary confinement, he paused to examine her work with what seemed like genuine appreciation. "Very productive night," he said, his politician's smile suggesting approval of her apparent compliance. "I'm glad you're finding ways to stay occupied." He studied the watercolor still life with particular interest, his expression thoughtful as he traced the careful arrangement of fruit with his eyes. "Quite sophisticated composition. You have real talent." But Lydia saw the calculation behind his praise, the way he catalogued each piece as evidence of her emotional state and potential compliance. Marcus Webb was a man who understood the value of information and the importance of controlling narratives, which made her secret exhibition all the more dangerous. If he ever decoded her visual messages, her situation would shift from imprisonment to something far more terminal. That night she returned to her post at the window with her heart hammering against her ribs and her eyes straining to penetrate the shadows below. She'd done everything she could to communicate her intelligence to the mysterious Dmitri, had created a breadcrumb trail of visual clues that should lead him to the truth about Marcus's broader criminal enterprise. Now all she could do was wait and hope that somewhere in the darkness below, ancient eyes were studying her work with the patience of centuries and the wisdom to act when action became possible. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Marcus Webb's hand gripped Lydia's elbow with the practiced pressure of a man who understood exactly how much force to apply without leaving visible bruises, his politician's smile never wavering, as he guided her through the marble corridors of City Hall, toward the council chambers, where his weekly performance of public service would unfold, before constituents who had no idea They were watching a predator, in a three-piece suit. "You remember what we discussed," he murmured close to her ear, his breath carrying the mint and coffee scent of a man who paid attention to such details. "You're my niece visiting from Portland, an art student interested in municipal architecture and historic preservation. Simple story, easy to remember, and it explains why you might be sketching during the meeting." His fingers tightened fractionally on her arm as they approached the double doors where other council members were, already greeting early arrivals with handshakes and the kind of warm eye contact that won elections. "And remember that your safety depends entirely on how well you play your part tonight." Lydia nodded submissively, though her mind raced as she catalogued the faces around her and tried to identify potential allies among the civic-minded citizens who attended these meetings with the earnest hope of making their community better. Marcus had dressed her carefully for this appearance, choosing clothes that suggested affluent family connections without drawing too much attention, styling her hair in a way that softened her features and made her look younger, more innocent, less like someone who might pose a threat to a corrupt politician's carefully constructed empire. The council chamber itself was a monument to democratic idealism, with its high ceilings and carved wood paneling that suggested gravitas and tradition. Though Lydia noticed the security cameras positioned to capture every angle of the room and wondered how many of those feeds went directly to Marcus's private servers. She took her assigned seat in the front row, close enough to the council table that any observers would naturally assume she belonged there, her sketchpad open and charcoal pencil poised as if she were simply documenting the architectural details that Marcus had supposedly brought her here to study. The meeting began with the usual procedural formalities, budget reports, and zoning discussions that formed the mundane backbone of municipal government. But Lydia's attention was caught by a man who entered during the preliminary business and took a seat near the back of the chamber. Even at a distance, something about his posture and the way he moved through the room with liquid grace set him apart from the other attendees, and when he turned his head to survey the crowd, she felt her breath catch as recognition hit her like a physical blow. Dmitri had somehow infiltrated this gathering, had walked into Marcus's territory with an audacity that bordered on supernatural, and was now studying the proceedings with eyes that seemed to catalog every detail for future reference. He'd dressed for the occasion in a way that explained his presence without drawing undue attention, wearing the kind of expensive but understated clothing that suggested old money and academic credentials, carrying a leather portfolio that reinforced his cover identity as someone with legitimate business before the council. When the meeting reached its public comment period, Dmitri rose with the fluid motion she remembered from their window conversation and approached the podium with papers in hand, his expression serious as he waited for the moderator to acknowledge him. "Good evening," he said, his voice carrying just enough of an accent to suggest European education and the kind of worldly perspective that impressed small-town politicians. "My name is Dmitri Ashworth, and I represent the Heritage Foundation for Historic Preservation. I'm here tonight to discuss concerns about proposed developments in the Victorian district and their impact on buildings of significant historical value." Marcus leaned forward with interest that seemed genuine, though Lydia caught the slight tension in his shoulders that suggested he was running mental calculations about this unexpected variable in his carefully controlled environment. The Victorian district was, after all, where he'd been housing her for the past week, and any increased scrutiny of that area could complicate his operations in ways she hoped he was beginning to appreciate. As Dmitri began his presentation about architectural significance and preservation standards, his eyes found hers across the room with the kind of casual glance that might have seemed random to any observer, but which carried volumes of communication for someone who understood the subtle languages of connection and recognition. Without breaking the flow of his speech about zoning regulations and historic designations, he shifted smoothly into a request that caught everyone in the room off guard. "I've prepared some materials in multiple formats to ensure accessibility for all community members," he continued, his gaze moving deliberately toward Lydia. "I wonder if there might be someone present who could provide sign language interpretation, as I believe we have deaf community members who would benefit from this information. The request hung in the air for a moment as Marcus processed its implications, his politician's instincts warring with his desire to maintain control over every aspect of Lydia's public appearance. But refusing such a reasonable accommodation request would look suspicious to the other council members and could generate exactly the kind of negative attention his criminal enterprise couldn't afford. Before he could formulate an objection, Lydia was already rising from her seat, her movements carrying the confidence of someone who finally had a legitimate reason to step into the spotlight. "I can help," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber, despite the flatness that came from never hearing her own words. "I'm fluent in ASL and would be happy to interpret for anyone who needs it." Marcus's smile never faltered, but she saw the warning flash in his eyes as she approached the front of the room, positioning herself where both Dmitri and any deaf audience members could see her hands clearly. What followed was a masterpiece of public deception, a conversation that appeared to focus on municipal budgets and preservation guidelines, but which actually functioned as an intelligence exchange conducted in plain sight of dozens of witnesses who had no idea they were observing anything more significant than routine civic engagement. Dimitri's presentation provided the framework, his discussion of specific buildings and their historical importance, creating opportunities for Lydia to ask clarifying questions. That seemed perfectly appropriate for an interpreter seeking accuracy. When he mentioned the importance of protecting vulnerable structures from exploitation, her signed interpretation included subtle variations that asked whether he had actionable intelligence about specific threats. His response about preservation requiring community vigilance incorporated hand movements that confirmed his understanding of her coded messages from the apartment window and his growing awareness of Marcus's broader criminal activities. The conversation deepened as Dmitri discussed the challenges of maintaining historical integrity in the face of modern pressures, his words creating space for Lydia to demonstrate her knowledge of both art history and sign language in ways that showcased the remarkable depth of their connection. When he referenced specific architectural details that could only be appreciated by someone with extensive training in visual analysis, her interpretation revealed a level of cultural and intellectual compatibility that transcended their impossible circumstances. Marcus watched from the council table with growing unease as he witnessed what appeared to be perfect professional collaboration, but which his predatory instincts recognized as something far more dangerous to his interests. The chemistry between his captive and this unexpected preservation advocate was unmistakable, crackling through their formal exchanges like electricity through water, and he began to suspect that Dmitri Ashworth's appearance at tonight's meeting was far from coincidental. As the presentation concluded, and Dmitri thanked both the council and his interpreter for their assistance, his eyes met Lydia's with an intensity that made her chest tight with hope and terror in equal measure. The brief contact lasted only seconds, but in that moment, she felt the full weight of his commitment to her safety and her growing dependence on his protection, emotions that had no place in a public forum, but which seemed impossible to suppress in his presence. The meeting adjourned with the usual pleasantries and networking conversations that marked successful municipal gatherings, but Marcus's grip on her elbow as he guided her toward the exit carried none of its earlier restraint. His politician's mask remained firmly in place until they reached the privacy of his car, but once the doors closed and the engine started, his facade cracked enough to reveal the predator underneath. "Interesting presentation," he said conversationally as he pulled into traffic, though his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "Quite a coincidence that Mr. Ashworth needed an interpreter tonight, don't you think? And even more coincidental that you were available to help." His tone remained pleasant, but Lydia heard the threat underneath and understood that her public performance had created new dangers, even as it had provided the first direct communication with her potential savior. That night, as Marcus completed his usual security routine and locked her into the apartment that had become her world, Lydia positioned herself at the window with a mixture of anticipation and dread that made her hands shake as she waited for movement in the shadows below. She didn't have to wait long before Dmitri materialized from the darkness, with the same impossible grace she remembered. But tonight, he approached the building itself, rather than remaining in the alley, his pale face appearing outside her third-floor window, with a suddenness that should have been impossible without climbing equipment or supernatural abilities. "I can get you out of here tonight." His hand signed through the glass, each gesture sharp with urgency and determination. "I have transportation waiting, and safe houses where Marcus Webb will never find you." The offer hung between them like a lifeline, and for a moment, Lydia felt the overwhelming temptation to simply nod and trust this mysterious protector to carry her away from the nightmare her life had become. But even as her heart raced with the possibility of freedom, her conscience rebelled against the idea of escape without justice, of saving herself while leaving Marcus free to continue destroying other lives. "No," she signed back, her hands moving with the firm resolve that had gotten her into this situation in the first place. "I won't run while he's still free to hurt other people. I've seen evidence of other victims, other disappearances that he's covered up with his political connections. If I leave without exposing him, those people die for nothing." Dimitri's expression shifted as he processed her refusal, and she saw something that might have been admiration replacing the frustration she'd expected. "You would risk your own life to protect strangers," he signed, his movements slower now, more thoughtful. "That kind of courage is rare in any century." His use of the phrase "any century" caught her attention, adding to the growing collection of details that suggested his background included more history than any normal person should possess. "Who are you really?" she asked, her hands spelling out the question she'd been afraid to voice directly. "What aren't you telling me about yourself?" Before Dmitri could respond, the sound of footsteps on the building's stairway sent ice through her veins, and she saw his entire body tense as predatory instincts she was only beginning to understand kicked into high alert. Marcus was returning hours earlier than his usual schedule, possibly suspicious after the evening's performance, possibly operating on some instinct that warned him his carefully constructed plans were beginning to unravel. Dimitri's hands moved in rapid warning signals, telling her to get away from the window and act natural. But as he prepared to vanish back into the shadows, she caught a glimpse of his eyes, reflecting the gas lamp light, like polished silver, inhuman and beautiful and terrifying in their intensity. In that instant, as footsteps approached her door and supernatural fury flickered across features that belonged in a museum painting, rather than the modern world, Lydia finally understood that her mysterious protector was something far more dangerous and wonderful than she'd ever imagined, and that her desperate plea for salvation had been answered by forces that operated according to rules older than the city above their feet. The silence after Marcus's footsteps retreated down the hallway stretched between Lydia and the window like a held breath, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would draw him back to investigate the sound that existed only in her chest. Dmitri had vanished the instant the key turned in her lock, melting into shadows with a fluidity that defied physics, and left her questioning whether the silver flash in his eyes had been real or a trick of gas lamp light filtered through old glass. But when she pressed her face to the window an hour later, after Marcus had completed his usual security check and departed for whatever nocturnal business occupied his evenings, pale hands emerged from the darkness below with the patient inevitability of sunrise, spelling words that would reshape her understanding of the world forever. "I owe you truth," his fingers shaped in the amber glow, each gesture carrying the weight of centuries and the careful precision of someone who had learned that words possessed power beyond their surface meaning. "What you saw in my eyes tonight was not imagination or fear. I am not entirely what your species would consider human, though I was born mortal in an age when your country existed only in the dreams of explorers who had not yet learned to navigate by stars they could not see from European shores." The revelation hung between them like smoke, visible and insubstantial and impossible to ignore, while Lydia's mind raced through the implications with the methodical analysis she applied to art history puzzles that required her to identify anachronisms in paintings or decode symbolic meanings in religious iconography. The formal structure of his signing, the archaic phrasing that had marked their conversations from the beginning, the way shadows seemed to bend around him rather than fall across his form, the inhuman grace with which he moved between pools of light and darkness. The evidence had been accumulating like brushstrokes on canvas, creating a picture she had been too overwhelmed to step back and examine until this moment of forced clarity. Vampire, she signed back, the word feeling strange beneath her fingers despite her intellectual understanding that such creatures had formed the backbone of folklore across every culture that had ever feared the dark. The myths and legends her literature classes had dissected as metaphors for disease, xenophobia, and sexual anxiety suddenly took on weight and substance as she contemplated the impossible reality of holding a conversation with something that should not exist outside the pages of Gothic novels. Yes, Dmitri confirmed, his hands moving with the careful deliberation of someone who understood the magnitude of secrets being shared. But not the creatures of your modern films and fiction. We are bound by laws older than your civilization, codes that govern our interactions with your kind and limit our influence over mortal affairs. I am what your legends might call a king among my people, though I have chosen isolation over the dominion that such titles traditionally carry. The word king sent ice through her veins as she processed the implications of being protected by someone whose power extended beyond anything she could comprehend. But it was followed immediately by warmth as she recognized the sacrifice implicit in his confession. To reveal supernatural secrets to a human required either tremendous trust or complete indifference to consequences, and everything about Dimitri's careful approach to her situation suggested the former rather than the latter. His entire demeanor conveyed the loneliness of someone who had spent centuries maintaining necessary distance from the mortal world, watching humanity evolve while remaining forever apart, until circumstances had created this impossible connection across species lines. "Why tell me this?" she asked, though part of her already understood the answer in the growing recognition that their bond had evolved beyond simple protector and victim into something that required honesty even when honesty carried mortal danger. "Why risk exposing your people for one human girl you barely know?" "Because you are not just one human girl," Dmitri replied, his silver eyes catching the gas lamp glow as his hands shaped words that seemed to come from depths she could barely fathom. "Because in 5 centuries of existence, I have never encountered someone who speaks my preferred language with such natural grace, who processes visual information with the artistic sophistication to decode references that span millennia, who possesses the moral courage to refuse safety when it comes at the cost of justice for others. Because watching you create coded messages in artistic form reminded me why I learned to value beauty and communication over the raw power that my nature provides." His words hit her like physical blows, each gesture revealing depths of connection she had barely begun to explore. And suddenly her hands were moving in response without conscious direction from her overwhelmed mind. "I've been drawing you," she confessed, her signing quick and nervous as she gestured toward the sketchpad she'd hidden beneath her pillow. "Ever since that first night, I've been trying to capture what I see when you emerge from the shadows, but I keep getting it wrong because you're not what my art training taught me to expect from dangerous creatures. You're beautiful in the way medieval manuscripts depicted angels, all sharp lines and impossible grace, but there's something else. Something that makes my chest tight and my hands shake when I try to translate it into charcoal and paper." "Show me," Dmitri signed, and something in his expression suggested vulnerability beneath the supernatural confidence, as if her artistic interpretation of his nature mattered more than centuries of carefully maintained self-image. Lydia retrieved her hidden sketchpad with trembling fingers, turning to pages she had filled during the long hours when Marcus's absence allowed her to process her complicated feelings through the visual language that had always made more sense to her than words. The drawings revealed her evolution of understanding, starting with tentative attempts to capture his physical appearance, and progressing toward more abstract interpretations that focused on the interplay between light and shadow, protection and isolation, ancient wisdom and contemporary loneliness. Each sketch built on the previous one, creating a narrative arc that transformed a mysterious stranger into something approaching portraiture of the soul rather than mere documentation of supernatural features. "This is how I see you," she signed as he studied her work with an intensity that made her feel exposed and exhilarated simultaneously, not as a monster or a predator, but as someone who has carried the weight of protecting others for so long that you've forgotten what it feels like to be protected yourself. Someone who learned silence not as a limitation, but as a form of poetry, who understands that the most important conversations happen in the spaces between words. Her artistic interpretations seemed to affect him more profoundly than she had anticipated, his usually controlled expression softening as he processed her visual translation of their growing connection. For the first time since their initial encounter, Dimitri's supernatural composure cracked enough to reveal the man he had been before transformation, someone who had valued beauty and communication and the rare gift of being truly understood by another soul. "You see clearly," he signed finally, his hands moving with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "Too clearly for your own safety, perhaps. My council grows suspicious of my involvement with mortal affairs, and there are other threats rising that require a vampire king's attention. Werewolf packs testing our territorial boundaries, rogue vampires breaking the ancient covenants that keep our species hidden, political pressures that could expose the supernatural world, if not handled with delicate precision. But despite these obligations, despite centuries of learned caution, I find myself unwilling to abandon this connection we have built through window glass and shared silence." Their conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of footsteps on cobblestone, multiple sets moving with purpose through the alley system that connected her prison to the broader network of Victorian-era streets where Marcus conducted his criminal business. Dimitri's head turned with predatory alertness as he processed sounds her ears could not detect, his expression shifting from tender vulnerability to supernatural menace in the space between heartbeats. "We are being watched," he signed, his movements economical and urgent as he prepared to vanish back into protective shadows. "Your captor has installed additional surveillance since our public meeting, and there are others moving through these streets tonight who do not belong to his organization." The revelation sent terror through her system as she realized that her situation was escalating beyond simple kidnapping into something that involved multiple hostile parties with conflicting agendas, any of which could result in her death as collateral damage in conflicts she barely understood. But even as fear threatened to overwhelm her capacity for rational thought, she found herself focusing on the careful precision of Dimitri's signing, the way he continued to communicate in her preferred language, even when supernatural urgency demanded quick action. That small gesture of consideration in the face of danger revealed more about his character than hours of philosophical discussion could have accomplished. "Go," she urged him, her hands spelling the command even as her heart rebelled against the idea of losing their connection before she had fully processed the magnitude of what he had revealed. "Don't let them catch you here because of me. I can handle Marcus and whatever political games he's playing, but I can't handle the guilt if your people turn against you because you risked everything to protect someone you barely know." The phrase "barely know" hung between them like a challenge, and Dimitri's response carried all the weight of centuries spent maintaining careful emotional distance from mortal concerns. "I know you well enough to recognize courage that shames immortals who have forgotten what it means to fight for justice rather than survival," he signed back. "Well enough to see that your artistic soul processes truth through beauty rather than accepting convenient lies that would make life simpler. Well enough to understand that abandoning you now would diminish something essential in myself that 500 years of undeath have not quite managed to kill." His words hit her like lightning, illuminating corners of her heart she had not realized existed, while simultaneously terrifying her with their implications. But before she could formulate a response adequate to the magnitude of what he had shared, Dmitri was gone, disappearing into darkness with supernatural speed that left only the memory of silver eyes and careful hands spelling promises she hoped he would be able to keep. Alone again in her prison apartment, Lydia pressed her face to the window and tried to process the revelation that her mysterious protector was not merely dangerous, but supernaturally so, not merely attracted to her, but willing to risk everything he had built over centuries. For the possibility of connection she represented. The knowledge should have terrified her, should have sent her running toward any escape that would distance her from creatures and conflicts beyond human understanding. Instead, she found herself more determined than ever to survive whatever challenges lay ahead, because somewhere in the darkness below, an immortal king was choosing love over power, and she refused to let his sacrifice be wasted on someone too cowardly to fight for the future they might build together if they could navigate the deadly complexities of their impossible circumstances. The security monitor's blue glow illuminated Marcus Webb's face as he reviewed footage that confirmed his growing suspicions about Lydia's mysterious compliance over the past week, her sudden willingness to cooperate with his public appearances, her apparent acceptance of captivity that had never quite rung true despite her convincing performance at the city council meeting. Frame by frame, the infrared cameras he'd installed throughout the alley system revealed a pattern that made his blood run cold with the realization that his carefully constructed operation was being observed by someone with resources and patience that exceeded anything he'd encountered in 2 decades of criminal enterprise. The figure appeared consistently between 2 and 4 in the morning, materializing from shadows in ways that defied logical explanation, positioning himself with clear sightlines to Lydia's window while remaining invisible to standard surveillance equipment, until Marcus had upgraded to military-grade thermal imaging that cost more than most people's annual salaries. But even the advanced technology struggled to capture clear images of the intruder, as if something about his physical presence interfered with electronic recording devices in ways that suggested either sophisticated countermeasures or characteristics that fell outside normal human parameters. Marcus paused the footage on a frame that showed pale hands moving in deliberate patterns against the darkness, and his politician's mind cataloged details that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of his situation. The intruder's movements possessed a fluidity that spoke of extensive training in either dance or martial arts. His positioning demonstrated tactical awareness that suggested military or intelligence background, and his apparent ability to communicate with Lydia through sign language indicated planning and preparation that extended far beyond casual intervention in a random kidnapping. Most unsettling of all was the man's apparent age, which seemed inconsistent between different camera angles, as if the recording equipment couldn't quite capture his features with the precision necessary for reliable identification. The revelation that Lydia had been conducting clandestine communications with an unknown party explained her recent behavior, her apparent cooperation masking what Marcus now recognized as intelligence gathering and strategic planning with an outside contact whose resources remained frustratingly unclear. But Marcus Webb had not built his criminal empire by underestimating threats or allowing problems to fester until they destroyed everything he'd worked to create. If Lydia's mysterious protector wanted to play games with a corrupt politician who had survived 2 decades of federal investigations and rival criminal organizations, then Marcus would demonstrate why his operation had endured while others had fallen to law enforcement or more ruthless competitors. He reached for his encrypted phone and dialed a number that connected him to contacts within the city's police department, who had been accepting his payments for years in exchange for looking the other way when certain activities required official blindness. Detective Raymond Torres had been on Marcus's payroll since his rookie year, back when a gambling addiction had made him vulnerable to the kind of financial pressure that created lasting loyalty and over the intervening decade he had developed into one of Marcus's most valuable assets for situations that required the illusion of legitimate law enforcement response. Torres, Marcus said when the call connected, "I need a favor that involves some of your more specialized equipment and a willingness to ask no questions about targets or methodology. The kind of favor that comes with the bonus compensation we discussed for extraordinary circumstances." He outlined his requirements with the careful precision of someone who understood that successful criminal operations depended on clear communication and realistic assessment of available resources. The intruder appeared to possess advanced combat training and possibly military-grade equipment, which meant standard police response would be inadequate for containment or elimination. What Marcus needed was a tactical team with sniper support and ammunition specifically designed to incapacitate targets who might be wearing advanced body armor or who possessed unusual physical capabilities that rendered conventional weapons less effective. The conversation revealed the depth of Marcus's preparation for contingencies that most criminals never considered, his understanding that successful predators must be ready to adapt when their prey proved more dangerous than initial assessment had suggested. Torres confirmed that he could assemble a team within 4 hours and position them throughout the alley system with overlapping fields of fire that would make escape impossible for any intruder attempting to approach Lydia's window. The tactical plan included electronic jamming equipment to prevent communication between the target and any backup he might have waiting, plus specialized ammunition that Marcus had specifically requested after researching methods for dealing with threats that fell outside normal human parameters. The wooden bullets were expensive and difficult to acquire through legitimate channels, but Marcus's connections to international arms dealers had made procurement possible, and his instincts told him that conventional ammunition might prove inadequate against someone whose physical capabilities seemed to exceed normal human limits. That evening, as Marcus completed his preparations for what he expected to be the final resolution of his Lydia problem, he found himself studying her with renewed appreciation for her intelligence and resourcefulness. She sat at her usual position by the window, sketchpad in hand, apparently absorbed in the kind of artistic work that had convinced him she was adapting to her captivity rather than planning escape or resistance. But now he recognized the coded communications hidden within her drawings, the visual messages she'd been sending to her mysterious protector, the sophisticated intelligence operation she'd been conducting under his nose while maintaining a facade of helpless compliance that would have fooled anyone who underestimated her capabilities. "You've been busy," he said conversationally, settling into the chair across from her with the relaxed confidence of someone who held all the tactical advantages. "Quite the prolific artist this week. I particularly admire the way you've incorporated historical references into your work. Very sophisticated visual storytelling." Lydia's hands paused in their sketching motion, and he saw her recognize the threat implicit in his tone, despite his carefully maintained pleasant expression. Her artistic mind was probably racing through the implications of his words, calculating how much he knew about her communications and what that knowledge meant for her survival. But Marcus had moved beyond the point where her cooperation or resistance mattered to the outcome of this situation. The trap was set, the tactical team was in position, and all that remained was waiting for her mysterious protector to make his predictable appearance so that Marcus could eliminate the threat and return his operation to its previous state of secure anonymity. The hours passed with agonizing slowness as Marcus monitored his surveillance equipment and coordinated with Torres through encrypted communications that confirmed the tactical team's readiness to engage any target that approached the building. Lydia maintained her position at the window with growing tension that she tried to hide through continued sketching, but Marcus could see the worry lines around her eyes as she processed the change in his demeanor and recognized that whatever protection she'd been counting on was about to be tested against resources she couldn't possibly understand or anticipate. At 2:30 in the morning, thermal imaging detected the familiar heat signature approaching through the alley system with the same fluid grace that had marked all previous appearances. But this time, Marcus was ready with countermeasures that would transform the intruder's protective instincts into the mechanism of his own destruction. He watched through multiple camera angles as the figure moved between pools of shadow and gaslight, apparently unaware that sniper scopes were tracking his movement from 3 different positions, each marksman equipped with ammunition specifically chosen for maximum effectiveness against targets whose physical capabilities might exceed normal human parameters. Lydia's hands began moving frantically in warning signals that Marcus could now recognize as sign language communication, her face pressed against the window glass as she tried to alert her protector to the danger converging on his position from multiple directions simultaneously. But Marcus had anticipated this possibility and positioned himself where he could interrupt her communications at the crucial moment, grabbing her wrists and pulling her away from the window, just as the first sniper acquired his target and prepared to fire the wooden bullet that would end Lydia's hope of rescue, and Marcus's problems with unwanted interference in his criminal enterprise. The confrontation that followed revealed depths of fury and power that Marcus had not anticipated, despite his careful research into supernatural threats and his procurement of specialized weapons designed to deal with creatures that existed outside normal human experience. Lydia's protector moved with inhuman speed as the first bullet splintered against brick where his head had been microseconds earlier, his response demonstrating combat reflexes that belonged in medieval battlefields rather than modern urban environments. The apartment's windows exploded inward as Dmitri crashed through glass and frame with force that reduced the barrier to glittering fragments, his pale features transformed by rage that seemed to draw power from centuries of suppressed violence, finally given legitimate target and purpose. Marcus found himself facing something that his political instincts and criminal experience had not prepared him to handle. A predator whose capabilities exceeded the bounds of human possibility and whose protective fury made every dangerous person Marcus had ever encountered seem like children playing with toys. The wooden bullets that should have incapacitated or killed any normal target seemed to cause pain without permanent damage, slowing Dimitri's advance, but failing to stop his methodical dismantling of Marcus's tactical advantages and the corrupt systems that had made his criminal empire possible. Between moments of explosive violence, as Marcus scrambled for weapons and communication devices that Dmitri destroyed with surgical precision, Lydia witnessed something that redefined her understanding of both protection and the supernatural forces that had entered her life. Dimitri's hands moved in quick, reassuring signs even as he fought off multiple attackers, his communication with her continuing despite the chaos surrounding them, his ancient eyes never losing track of her safety even when bullets and tactical equipment required his immediate attention. The apartment became a battlefield where medieval instincts clashed with modern weapons, where centuries of accumulated combat experience met contemporary criminal resources, where love and duty converged in ways that made Marcus's carefully planned ambush look like amateur theater compared to the real drama unfolding between predator and protector, captor and victim, mortal corruption and immortal justice, finally brought into direct confrontation after a week of careful maneuvering and strategic positioning that had led inevitably to this moment of explosive resolution. The emergency session of the City Council had been called ostensibly to address what the local media was describing as an unprecedented outbreak of gang violence in the Victorian district, though the assembled politicians and concerned citizens had no idea they were about to witness the systematic dismantling of a corruption network that had operated with impunity for over 2 decades through the careful manipulation of democratic processes and public trust. Marcus Webb sat at his customary position on the council dais, with his left arm in a sling and barely concealed bandages covering cuts that would require weeks to heal properly, his political smile strained but intact, as he prepared to spin the previous night's supernatural confrontation into a narrative that would preserve his reputation while eliminating the threats that Lydia and her mysterious protector represented to his criminal enterprise. The council chamber buzzed with nervous energy as reporters and civic activists filled every available seat, drawn by rumors of corruption scandals and violence that had finally penetrated the careful media management that had kept Marcus's activities hidden from public scrutiny for years. But Marcus had underestimated both his opponents and the depth of preparation they had undertaken while he focused on immediate tactical concerns rather than the broader strategic implications of challenging people whose resources and determination exceeded anything his experience had taught him to anticipate. Lydia entered the chamber with Dmitri at her side, both of them carrying the kind of extensive documentation that suggested months rather than days of investigative work, their coordinated presentation materials revealing a level of organization and legal sophistication that made Marcus's stomach clench with the first real fear he had experienced since building his political career on the foundation of carefully calculated risks and manageable opponents. She had traded her artist's casual clothing for the kind of professional attire that commanded respect in civic settings, while Dmitri wore the expensive but understated suit that reinforced his cover identity as a historic preservation consultant whose expertise would lend credibility to whatever accusations they were preparing to level against a sitting city councilman. The session began with Mayor Patricia Hernandez calling for order and acknowledging the unusual circumstances that had necessitated this emergency gathering, her expression grave as she outlined the agenda that would address recent criminal activities and their impact on community safety and public trust in local government institutions. Marcus used his opening statement to establish the narrative framework he hoped would contain whatever damage his opponents were planning to inflict, describing himself as a victim of criminal harassment who had been targeted by unknown assailants with sophisticated resources and apparent connections to organized crime networks that operated beyond local law enforcement capabilities. His performance demonstrated the rhetorical skills that had won him elections for over a decade, the careful balance of vulnerability and strength that made voters feel protective while maintaining confidence in his leadership abilities. But when Lydia approached the podium for public comment, the atmosphere in the chamber shifted as she began laying out evidence that revealed the intricate web of corruption, money laundering, and human trafficking that Marcus had constructed using his political position as both shield and weapon against anyone who threatened his criminal activities. Her presentation combined visual aids that showcased her artistic training with documentary evidence that demonstrated investigative skills far beyond what anyone would expect from a college art student, creating a multimedia experience that held the audience's attention while building an irrefutable case against the man who had held her captive for over a week. The centerpiece of her testimony was a series of architectural drawings and historical maps that she had created during her imprisonment, works that appeared to be academic exercises in historic preservation, but which actually documented the locations and operational patterns of Marcus's criminal network with the precision of intelligence reports prepared by professional analysts. Each drawing contained multiple layers of information encoded in visual symbols that referenced art historical traditions spanning centuries, creating communications that would be invisible to casual observers, but which revealed comprehensive understanding of criminal activities to anyone with the knowledge necessary to decode her sophisticated visual language. Dimitri's supporting presentation provided the historical context that transformed Lydia's artistic evidence into a compelling narrative of corruption that spanned decades. His extensive knowledge of municipal records and property transactions revealing patterns that no single investigator should have been able to uncover without access to archives that were supposed to be protected by privacy laws and bureaucratic procedures. His formal speaking style and obvious familiarity with legal terminology suggested background in law or government that explained his ability to navigate complex regulatory systems, while his references to historical precedents demonstrated the kind of institutional memory that made his testimony particularly damaging to Marcus's carefully constructed public image. The partnership between Lydia and Dmitri during their joint presentation revealed a level of intellectual and emotional compatibility that transcended their unusual circumstances. Their ability to complete each other's thoughts and build on each other's evidence, creating a synergistic effect that made their individual contributions more powerful than the sum of their parts. When Lydia described the visual codes hidden in medieval manuscript illuminations, Dmitri provided historical context that explained how such communication systems had been used by monasteries to preserve knowledge during periods of political persecution. When Dmitri outlined the legal implications of using municipal contracts for money laundering, Lydia illustrated the financial flows through diagrams that made complex criminal schemes comprehensible to ordinary citizens who lacked specialized knowledge of accounting procedures or regulatory frameworks. Their coordinated attack on Marcus's credibility and criminal activities demonstrated months of preparation compressed into days of intensive collaboration, but more importantly, it revealed the perfect communication partnership that had developed between two people whose different backgrounds and abilities created complementary strengths rather than competing priorities. Marcus watched his carefully constructed political career disintegrate in real time, as evidence mounted beyond his ability to deflect or discredit. His usual strategies of character assassination and procedural manipulation rendered useless against opponents who had anticipated his countermeasures and prepared responses to every argument his legal training had taught him to deploy. The corruption network that had seemed invulnerable when protected by political influence and criminal connections suddenly appeared fragile and exposed when subjected to the kind of systematic analysis that revealed patterns invisible to individual victims, but obvious to investigators with sufficient resources and determination to pursue justice, regardless of personal costs. But even as Marcus's immediate threats were neutralized through public exposure and legal procedures that would eventually result in criminal prosecution, the chamber was about to become the stage for a different kind of confrontation that would test whether Dimitri's commitment to protecting Lydia could survive pressures that originated from supernatural rather than human sources. The temperature in the room dropped perceptibly as 5 figures entered through the main doors, with the kind of synchronized movement that suggested military training or supernatural coordination, their formal attire and obvious wealth marking them as the kind of power brokers who usually operated behind closed doors, rather than appearing at public meetings where their activities might attract unwanted attention from media representatives or federal agencies that monitored unusual gatherings for signs of organized crime or terrorist activity. Dimitri's posture shifted subtly as he recognized the newcomers, his casual confidence replaced by the kind of alertness that preceded either diplomatic negotiation or violent confrontation, his hands moving in quick warning signs that told Lydia to stay close while maintaining the appearance of normal civic engagement. The lead figure among the newcomers was an elegant woman whose silver hair and expensive jewelry suggested old money and established power, her movements carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the chamber unconsciously defer to her presence, despite having no idea who she was or what business brought her to this particular gathering. When she approached Dmitri with the fluid grace of a predator closing distance to prey, their silent conversation unfolded in sign language that created a supernatural drama playing out in plain sight of dozens of witnesses who remained completely oblivious to the life and death decisions being negotiated through gestures that appeared to be casual communication between deaf community members. Serafina's hands shaped ultimatums that had been centuries in the making, her elegant fingers spelling out ancient laws and modern consequences with the precision of someone who had helped write the rules that governed supernatural society since before the American colonies had declared independence from European monarchs. Your involvement with mortal affairs has reached levels that threaten our entire species, she signed with deadly calm. The covenant of silence exists to protect vampire society from discovery, and your public activities with this human woman create exposure risks that no individual relationship can justify. You will abandon this connection immediately and return to your proper duties as our king, or you will face exile from our society and loss of all protections that royal status provides against our enemies. Dimitri's response revealed the depth of his transformation over the past weeks, his hands moving with the kind of quiet determination that preceded decisions that could never be reversed or regretted, regardless of their consequences. For 5 centuries, I have served our people by maintaining distance from the mortal world, by choosing isolation over connection, by sacrificing personal desires for the greater good of vampire survival. But I have found something in this partnership that gives meaning to existence beyond mere survival, something worth risking everything I have built to preserve and protect. I choose love over power, connection over isolation, the possibility of building something new over the certainty of maintaining something that no longer serves my understanding of what makes existence worthwhile. The words hanging between them carried implications that rippled through vampire society's carefully structured hierarchy, triggering ancient protocols that had been written to prevent exactly this kind of challenge to established authority and supernatural law. Seraphina's expression hardened as she processed Dimitri's abdication of his throne in favor of a mortal relationship that violated every principle their species had developed to ensure survival in a world that would destroy them if their existence became widely known. The trial by combat that followed was brief but devastating. A clash between centuries of accumulated power and the desperate fury of a challenger who understood that winning meant inheriting responsibility for vampire society's survival, while losing meant death and the destruction of everything Dimitri had sacrificed his crown to protect. But when the violence ended and Dimitri stood victorious over his chosen successor, the cost of his choices became clear in Seraphina's final pronouncement that severed all ties between him and the supernatural community that had defined his existence since medieval battlefields had taught him the price of protecting innocence from predators who cared nothing for justice or mercy or love. The federal courthouse steps gleamed wet with October rain as Marcus Webb was led away in handcuffs that caught the flash of news cameras, his political career ending not with the kind of scandal that allowed for eventual rehabilitation, but with charges that would ensure he spent the remainder of his natural life in institutions designed for criminals whose actions had placed them permanently outside civilized society. The money laundering convictions alone carried sentences that stretched beyond any reasonable hope of parole, but the human trafficking charges had triggered federal investigations that uncovered networks of corruption spanning multiple states and involving politicians whose names would dominate headlines for months as prosecutors worked through the evidence that Lydia and Dimitri had compiled during their week of desperate collaboration. Detective Raymond Torres had accepted a plea bargain that would see him testifying against his former colleagues in exchange for a reduced sentence, his gambling debts and financial desperation creating a cautionary tale about the price of compromising professional integrity for short-term solutions to long-term problems. The new Vampire King, surprisingly, had proven more merciful than anyone had expected when he quietly dismantled Marcus's supernatural connections, ensuring that the corrupt politician's criminal associates who possessed knowledge of vampire society either disappeared permanently or found themselves with carefully edited memories that removed any dangerous information about immortal predators who preferred to remain legends rather than documented threats. Victor had assumed Dimitri's former throne with reluctance. Rather than ambition, his military background making him well suited to the defensive strategies that vampire survival required, but leaving him uncomfortable with the kind of political maneuvering that had characterized Seraphina's preferred approach to supernatural governance. His first official act had been to declare Dimitri's exile honorable rather than shameful, a gesture of respect for centuries of faithful service that stopped just short of offering reinstatement, but which provided protection against the kind of vindictive persecution that might have followed a more traditional abdication crisis. Meanwhile, Lydia found herself navigating the aftermath of trauma and revelation with resources she had never imagined possessing. Dimitri's centuries of accumulated wealth, providing not just material security, but the foundation for projects that could transform her ordeal into something approaching justice for the broader community that had suffered while Marcus's corruption went unchallenged. The foundation they established together focused specifically on supporting deaf community programs that had been chronically underfunded by municipal budgets, that treated accessibility as an expensive accommodation rather than a fundamental right, their grants providing everything from ASL interpretation services to scholarship programs for deaf students pursuing careers in fields where communication barriers had historically limited opportunities for advancement. Working alongside Dimitri as they developed their philanthropic initiatives revealed depths of compatibility that extended far beyond the crisis management that had brought them together, his ancient patience complementing her modern innovation in ways that created synergistic effects neither of them could have achieved independently. His knowledge of historical patterns and long-term strategic thinking provided context for her artistic vision and social justice instincts, while her fresh perspective and technological literacy helped him adapt centuries of accumulated wisdom to contemporary challenges that required novel solutions rather than traditional approaches. But the growing intimacy of their partnership also forced them to confront questions that had no precedent in either of their previous experiences, conversations about mortality and immortality that carried implications extending far beyond typical relationship negotiations about commitment and shared futures. Dimitri's offer to share his vampiric nature with her represented not just romantic devotion, but practical necessity, if their partnership was to extend beyond the brief decades that mortal lifespan would allow. Yet the decision to abandon humanity for supernatural existence carried consequences that required careful consideration rather than emotional reaction to immediate circumstances. Lydia spent weeks researching everything available about vampire physiology and psychology, studying historical accounts and mythological representations with the same analytical rigor she applied to art historical problems that demanded careful evaluation of evidence and competing interpretations. The scientific literature was obviously limited by the supernatural community's commitment to secrecy, but Dimitri's willingness to answer her questions with complete honesty provided insights into immortal existence that helped her understand both the advantages and costs of the choice he was offering her to make. The physical transformation itself was apparently less traumatic than popular fiction suggested, more like recovering from serious illness than experiencing death and resurrection. But the psychological adjustments required to cope with centuries of existence while watching mortal friends and family age and die presented challenges that no amount of preparation could fully anticipate. More importantly, vampire society's current hostility toward Dimitri's choices meant that transformation would not provide access to established supernatural communities, but would instead commit her to the same exile that his love for her had already created, making them dependent entirely on each other for the kind of social connection that sustained psychological health over extended periods of isolation. The decision remained unresolved as autumn deepened into winter, and their foundation work expanded to include the renovation of the building where their story had begun, transforming Marcus's former safe house into a community center that would serve as headquarters for their accessibility programs, while providing meeting spaces for deaf community organizations that had previously struggled to find appropriate venues. The architectural restoration required Dimitri to work closely with city planning officials who had no idea they were approving permits for a vampire's construction project. His centuries of experience with bureaucratic systems allowing him to navigate regulatory requirements with efficiency that impressed even the most cynical municipal employees who had grown accustomed to delays and complications from less experienced developers. Lydia threw herself into the interior design and program development with enthusiasm that helped her process the trauma of her imprisonment by transforming the space where she had experienced helplessness into something that would empower others facing similar challenges with communication barriers and social isolation. The irony was not lost on either of them that they were building their future together in the same rooms where Marcus had tried to destroy both their lives. But the creative energy required to reimagine the space for positive purposes provided healing that no amount of therapy or victim advocacy could have accomplished through traditional methods. 6 months after Marcus's conviction and sentencing, Lydia stood at the window of what had once been her prison cell and was now her office, watching Dmitri move through the community garden they had installed in the alley where he had first appeared to answer her desperate plea for salvation. The gas lamps still cast their amber pools of light between modern solar fixtures that provided practical illumination for evening programs, creating a blend of historical preservation and contemporary functionality that reflected their own relationship's merger of ancient wisdom and modern sensibilities. Children from the deaf community program played in spaces that had once witnessed criminal activities and supernatural confrontations, their laughter creating sounds that Lydia could not hear, but could feel through vibrations that traveled through the old building's bones and into her heart with every joyful movement. When Dmitri looked up from his gardening work and found her watching him through glass that no longer represented barrier but connection, her hands moved automatically in signs that had become as natural as breathing during their months of building something beautiful from the ruins of trauma and loss. "I'm home," she told him in the visual language that had brought them together across impossible circumstances, and his responding smile carried all the warmth and security she had never expected to find with someone whose existence defied everything she had thought she understood about the boundaries between possible and impossible, mortal and immortal, human and supernatural. The evening ASL classes were about to begin in the renovated spaces below, and together they would teach communication skills to students who ranged from hearing parents learning to talk with deaf children to elderly community members whose age-related hearing loss had created isolation that sign language could bridge with patience and practice. Dimitri's formal signing style had evolved through their partnership to incorporate more contemporary expressions while retaining the elegant precision that marked his centuries of experience, creating a teaching approach that honored both traditional ASL grammar and modern innovations in deaf education methodology. Their students had no idea that one of their instructors was an immortal creature who had learned sign language in medieval monasteries, but they responded to his patient encouragement and obvious respect for their communication preferences with the kind of trust that suggested he possessed insights into the experience of being different that extended beyond academic knowledge or professional training. As shadows lengthened and their evening programs concluded, Lydia and Dmitri found themselves alone in the community center they had built together, surrounded by the evidence of their successful collaboration and the promise of projects still to come. New supernatural threats were already emerging as vampire society adapted to Victor's leadership style, and rogue elements tested the boundaries of the ancient covenants that governed interaction between immortal species. But Lydia was discovering that her unique position as a mortal who understood supernatural society's existence made her valuable as a bridge between communities that had operated in isolation for too many centuries. The final decision about immortality remained unmade, but no longer felt urgent, as their partnership deepened into something that transcended questions about lifespan and entered territory where love measured itself in moments of perfect understanding rather than years of guaranteed togetherness. Their hands moved together in the private sign language they had developed during months of intimate conversation, gestures that combined traditional ASL with personal innovations that carried meanings no dictionary could capture, creating communication that belonged entirely to them and reflected the evolution of connection beyond anything either had imagined possible before crisis had forced them to risk everything for the chance of building something unprecedented together. Whether she chose mortality or immortality, whether their future stretched across decades or centuries, Whether they face their challenges as human and vampire, or as two immortal partners navigating supernatural society's complexities, Lydia knew with absolute certainty that their love story had already become the kind of legend that would outlast both their individual lives, a testament to the power of communication to bridge any barrier and create understanding where none had existed before. Proof that sometimes salvation comes not from escape, but from finding the perfect person with whom to face whatever darkness lies ahead.